I grew up going to Sunday school every Sunday. When you are a child of a person who grew up in that same church, my grandparents were a part of our church. When your dad is a Sunday school teacher and your mother volunteers in the nursery every week, you go to Sunday school every week. In fact, the only time I remember not being in Sunday school was when I had physical proof that I had chickenpox, and so I got to stay home that day. One day. I had marvelous Sunday school teachers. Evelyn Linton was one of them who taught third grade Sunday school, and I invited her to stand with me at the communion table for my ordination. That was the power of her teaching to me in those days. But I have to confess to you something, that all the time I was growing up, I thought that people like Moses and Abraham, Rebecca, Ruth, I thought they were all friends with each other. I thought they lived on the same block there in Jerusalem. They played with each other, went to each other's house for Christmas. Well, okay, maybe not Christmas, but that they knew each other, that they got along, that they went over to maybe Super Bowl parties, something like that. It wasn't until I was in high school and later in college when I realized that they were separated by hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, that they didn't know each other on a first name basis. Maybe that's like you. So when you hear a story about Nehemiah and Ezra, you kind of just throw them all together with all the other stories in the Old Testament and just say, well, what did that mean? And I'm glad we were in worship together and hope for something more concrete next time. So I'm going to give you a little primer today. See if you can stay with me for just a few minutes. We have creation story. You know, that was in the beginning, right? We're good on that. We have the fall, the sin of humanity. We have the flood. We have the covenant with Abraham and Sarah. So those things are in their place. And Abraham and Sarah were promised that their descendants would be more numerous than the stars in the night sky, and that they would possess a land called the Promised Land. And so, Abraham's descendants, you remember those people, they went down to Egypt and enjoyed great favor. You remember Joseph and his amazing Technicolor dream coat. That's a part of that sweep of history. But then a marvelous little phrase in the beginning of Exodus said that there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Those were ominous words, because from that moment on, the Israelites became slaves to the Egyptians. We're good on that? With me on the chronology here so far? There won't be a test, don't worry. So, we have Moses. Remember him? We have Moses and the plagues. I'm thinking about calling my garage band Moses and the Plagues, but we'll get back to you on that. And the last plague was when the angel of death would come through, and because the Israelites put the blood of the lamb on their doorposts and the threshold, then the angel of death would pass over those houses. So we have Passover. So Moses leads them out into the desert for 40 years because somebody wouldn't ask for directions. So 40 years they learned to be dependent on God. Then they made it into the Promised Land, everybody except Moses. A whole generation passed, and so Joshua leads them into the Promised Land. They enjoy great favor and success for many centuries there in the Promised Land. But they become complacent, and the Babylonians and others invade. They destroy, this is important to our text today, they destroy the temple, the walls of Jerusalem. They send the people out. It's called the diaspora. In our English, you can hear the word dispersion. They are scattered far and wide. They sing the lament, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And that's one of the psalms that we have. But then we get to Nehemiah. There becomes a time when the remnant can return to Jerusalem, and Nehemiah asks permission. So in some respects, he becomes the contractor. He becomes the motivational speaker. He gets the permission and procures all the materials needed and gets the Israelites to help him In fact, dramatically, Nehemiah stands in the breach, in the gap between the walls and said, we can do this, we can rebuild this. And the people start to help him. And so, as that process is moving along and as he encourages them day by day, they get to a part where they're fairly finished with all this. They discover the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses. In those times, that's what it was believed. And they decide they want to celebrate. And so on the first day of the 7th month, they are going to read the Torah to the people. Build this great scaffolding so that Ezra can stand high above the people. All the chief priests can also speak the word. Everybody's there. You hear that? Men, women, and anyone who can understand. That means the children who are old enough to understand. And they're going to read, and it's going to be a great, exciting, memorable day in the life of the people of Jerusalem. Except, as Ezra is reading to them, the people weep. Did you hear that? Nehemiah had to calm them down. Ezra had to as well. They wept when they heard the word of the Lord being spoken to them. Why do you think that is? I want you to put yourself in their place and imagine what it would be like if you know the sweep of your people's history, the good times and the bad, and most recently the diaspora and the coming back. You hear the word of the Lord and you weep. It could be because they were remembering all those who had been with them on the journey and the struggle, who were not still present to see this holy moment. It could be out of a relief that they were finally back to the place where they belonged, that life could be back to normal or a new kind of normal. But it also could be because they were afraid. In hearing the word of the law, they realized how far away from God they had traveled, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. And so they wept. I wonder if that's true for us at times. That we come to worship, and in some ways we remember everything that has happened to get us here. In some ways, we are just grateful for another moment where we can take a breath and be in the presence of the community of faith and let that community carry us and hold us in the difficult moments we face. And that sometimes we realize how far we are and how far we need to go. I met Marilyn Tuttle when I was first called to First Christian Church in Amarillo. She was chronologically gifted at that point. That was supposed to be funny, and you guys aren't hearing that. But Marilyn sat 6 rows back on the north side because she told me one time that's the perfect spot for the air conditioning and for the heat. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. She was the Goldilocks of the congregation. And I got to know her over the time that I was there, and she talked to me about her husband who had passed a few years before, about her 2 sons who no longer lived in Texas, but when she would introduce me to them when they'd come back for Christmas or Mother's Day or some other vacation, and she would say, "We are so glad we have them." And I thought that was a little bit of an odd way to put it. We are so glad we have them. But then later she told me why. Because she and her husband had been married for quite some time, had wanted to have children for so long, and could not. And so then decided that they would go the route of adoption, and even that was a lengthy process, excruciating at times. And she talked about that honestly and openly with me, about being in worship and wondering where God was in the midst of all that experience for them. And then finally the day came when they were able to adopt Phil and Tom, these 2 young boys. And so she developed a ritual with them each night, a nightly bedtime phrase that as she tucked them in, she would say, "We are so glad we have you." They did this so often and so much that even on the night when Phil was particularly difficult And his mother had had it up to here, and she sent him to bed, to his room. And then a few minutes later, he came out just wailing, saying, "You didn't say you were glad you had me." Even in the midst of that trauma, that was the connecting force. As I think about phrases, some of the most important phrases ever spoken, I think of Marilyn Tuttle's phrase, "We are so glad we have you. We are so blessed we have you." Because I want you to think through this with me. When I say I love you, that's my gift to you. That's my trying to say something toward you. But when I say, I'm so glad we have you, I'm so blessed that you are in my life, it's a recognizing inside of you something of God's love, of God's presence, of God's grace. And it's a building up of what's already in you, a recognition of what's already in you. I'm so glad that you're in my life is the most powerful phrase. And I remember that over the years I'd hoped that I would use that in my bedtime ritual, and I'm sad to say that I don't say it often enough. So Thursday, the end of the day, I decided I'd try it out on Dana. Hannah had already left the supper table, and we were just having a lull in our conversation. I said to Dana, "I'm so glad you're in my life." You know, in its loving response, she said, "What do you want?" She said, "You're not going to die, are you? And this is your last request." So we need a little practice, is what I'm telling you. But I think of Marilyn when I think of this story of Ezra and Nehemiah, that of people being in the presence of the community of faith, of hearing the Word of God, and knowing that that presence has sustained them through all the difficulties, through all the joys, through every moment of life, and just weeping for a sense of gratitude that we are so glad you are in our lives. I wonder if sometime this week you can say that to somebody with great meaning and heartfelt sincerity. Because I can say it to you through all the things that I've experienced over these many years. I am so glad you are in my life. I am so blessed.